Okay. So welcome everybody. My name is Christopher Carmona, and I'm going to be the moderator for today's panel, and I'm going to serve also as the host. Usually, the owner of Jade Press does this, but he's working on grants right now, so he turned the job over to me for this one. This event, History Has Eyes on You 5, dealing with the public history and museums and the interaction of these five scholars and how they've dealt with it throughout their careers. But I want to go ahead and start off that this is a series that is sponsored by Jade Publishing, and Jade Publishing is also the parent company of Latino Book Review, and so they also have a podcast as well. And they published a couple of my books, and one of my books is coming out soon from them. Um, and so they do all sorts of different things, and they are really supportive in having these type of conversations about what's going on out there. So, like I said, this is our fifth one that we've done, and I'm just gonna go ahead and pull up my notes here. So, yes, please look up J Publishing, and there are a press that publishes multilingually. They're international. Let me go ahead and put that is the website, so you can go and check out their books. They do children's books, they do novels, they do poetry, and they do all sorts of different things there. Um, but as for today, we are going to be talking about this particular subject. We're going to discuss the role of public history institutions like museums, libraries, and archives, and in the keeping of a white supremacist view of history. This panel will discuss these spaces that keep the public informed of quote unquote history, from working in traditional museums to specialized work as archivists, as well as the role of public history in higher education. Um, as for me, I've done a lot of different work dealing with museums, dealing with archives for the different books that I write and the articles that I work with, and also as a member of the Refusing to Forget project, which is a project dedicated to uncovering the violence and of against Latinos in this country. We mostly focus on ethnic Mexicans in the early 20th century in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. That is our primary, looking at lynchings and all the things that happened 100 years ago. But it also bleeds into a lot of this. So a lot of the work I've done is working within these spaces. Um, we're going to try and talk about the Texas Ranger Museum, but the Texas Ranger Museum deserves um, its own talk because there's so much wrong with that. But I will go into that what we're dealing with here is a subject that because history itself is mostly recognized through museums, if to most of the population. A lot of people, we look at, but when people look at museums, people look at how they kind of get this information about things. It's really through museums, through pop culture, through media, and these type of things. So to kind of look at the difficulties and things that we do for this. And so I'm going to go ahead and start off. We'll introduce our five panelists. Um, our first panelist is Michelle Tovad, and she's going to be talking about Latinx representation and working for Holocaust museums. So she is the Associate Director of Education and Latino Initiatives at the Houston Holocaust Museum, where she is responsible for building bridges between the Latino community and the museum. Her initiatives include outreach for bilingual dual language schools, creating educational workshops and events for teachers, parents, and the community, and working with local and national organizations dedicated to serving Latinos. Michelle earned her EDD at the University of Houston in curriculum and instruction in K through 12 social education with an emphasis on social justice. She is a former Smithsonian Latinos Museum Studies Fellow and a Fulbright Hays Scholar. So let's go ahead and welcome Dr. Michelle Tavad. Before she starts her press, I just want to let you know that if you guys have questions, um, make sure to go ahead and type them into the chat. And at the end of the presentations, we will go ahead and open it up to Q&A. So if you have questions or anything you want to add, just go ahead and put it in the chat and I will address it at the end. All right. Um, go ahead, Michelle. You are up.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And can everyone see that? Yeah, we're good?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. And I'll start my timer because I can ramble on. So thank you, everyone. And thank you for the invitation, Dr. Carmona. This is a fantastic panel. So I have been at Holocaust Museum Houston since 2015. Prior to the being here at the museum, there wasn't much of Latino initiatives involved, right? The community here was solely focused on a Eurocentric perspective, and many Latino narratives weren't included. So in 2015, that was my role to start to bring a bridge, a connection to the Latino community here in Houston. Our mission is, of course, to respect and honor the survivors of the Holocaust and remember the 6 million Jews and innocent victims who were murdered during that time. But we also use the lessons of the Holocaust and other genocides to teach the dangers of hatred, prejudice, and apathy. Not too long ago, our museum did put out a public value statement that helped promote the social justice work that we are doing here in the museum. And this was incredibly important because many people in the community were not conscious of the social justice work that was necessary for our visitors, right, to make connections to the past, to current issues. So this statement did really provide a platform for us. So why does representation matter in a Holocaust museum? Houston has the largest school district in Texas, which is HISD, and we do have predominantly about 61% of our students are of Latinx background. Many are Spanish speaking. And so we had to make that connection, right? I had to find a way, figure out how will the students who come through these doors, who come from Black and Brown communities, connect to the narratives that are on the walls, on the spaces that they're viewing. And so by that, we definitely wanted to analyze and understand what representation meant in this space. One of the first things that when I began here is I noticed that there wasn't much language accessibility. And there wasn't much representation in our staff, in our security, our docents, our volunteers, and in our admissions. And of course, exhibits and content and programming wasn't representative of the community. So that was my goal, to make sure that I could provide that accessibility, right? To provide that opportunity for students to see themselves, not solely students, but our visitors, our general public that was coming through our doors. And I'm showing you these pictures, and I apologize, I'm going pretty fast, but these some of these photos that you see here that I'm going to be showing you are events that have occurred at the museum, and it's incredibly important for me to highlight why it's important that they're here. This is an indigenous, of course, a dancer here in Houston that was present during one of our events. This is the first time we had ever had an indigenous representation in this space. So it was incredible, it was beautiful, and it was very important that was a part of our event. So one of our first exhibitions here at the museum that were bilingual in English and Spanish was the Bittersweet Harvest, the Bracero Program 1942 through 1964, that was curated by Dr. Mireya Loza and Stephen Velasquez. And it was one of our first events that brought in a narrative that did not solely focus on the Holocaust or another genocide. And this was an amazing experience and very successful in our museum space because, again, it brought in a new audience. It brought in visitors who had never been to our museum before, who were afraid to come to the museum, who didn't feel comfortable. But this provided that opportunity to share their narratives, to share their stories. And I have an image here at the bottom of a young woman and her father. And I guess I was that creepy educator that would go through the exhibits and kind of look to see and listen what people were saying and experiencing. But I did stop them because I overheard the young woman speaking to her father about this history. And her father stopped and told her, Mija, this is a part of your history as well. Your grandparent, your grandfather was a bracero. And I had to stop and take a picture of them and tell them, thank you for sharing your story with us, because this was incredibly important. And again, it highlighted how the community was coming into our space to experience what they had held in their families, but hadn't had the opportunity to talk about it. And we were very grateful to have Dr. Loza come and speak in depth about this history, and other programming was created around this. As you can see here, we also included music from that time, and this group was called Los Gatos del Norte, and they played conjunto music. And this again is an incredible piece of our inclusion, right? Bringing our music, our culture to a space that's been commonly a white space, right? So it's very important for us to again connect to our community. This, of course, was through Mexican American history. Also, one of our other great exhibits that came through our museum was recently a museum that was created through the Smithsonian through sites that focused on the narrative of Dolores Huerta. And this was incredibly important for us to have here again, because Dolores' story is a narrative that people do not commonly know about. And it was very mind-boggling, I guess, because when you grow up in a home where you learn Chicano history, it's something that's a part of you. But listening to students and visitors come through and hear, like, I've never heard of her, I only know Cesar Chavez. So we were able to share her story, her narrative, and it was again something that provided an opportunity for students to see themselves and hear themselves. And what was great about this exhibit is that it wasn't just a Mexican American or Mexican history experience, it was intercultural. We got to hear about the Jewish contributions, African American contributions to the United Farm Workers Union. This was an incredible experience to have Dolores Huerta here as well, to speak to our community. And many of our Jewish community were a part of the programming. And again, we're just astounded that they had not known of this history. So our museum also created a space, a human rights permanent gallery. Again, this is a brand new initiative. When we renovated the museum in 2019, we became a bilingual space in English and Spanish. We also have this human rights gallery. Again, it is a platform for us, a foundation for us to bring in new narratives, Latin American history, to bring in stories that have never been talked about in this space. And through that, here you see one of our representatives from the Smithsonian, Mikaki, who came in to speak to one of our groups, our school groups that came through. These students were mainly from Guatemala, Spanish being their second language, Indigenous their first, and English being their third, right? And so she was here representing the museum, speaking to these students about this history, the importance of it. And how they could connect to it, right? Bringing the history of Luisa Moreno from Guatemala. So the students had an incredible experience learning about that and seeing themselves in this. They made those connections. Before I move forward, I did want to go back to the Human Rights Gallery. When this gallery was created, there wasn't anyone else on the staff that was of Latinx background in the decision making at the table. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to have some input. Uh, Before this gallery was created, it was again, another white space. Scholars were not included. Scholars of color were not included. It really took my initiative, and I'm gonna say my loud mouth, to really push to get scholars of color involved in our work here in the Human Rights Gallery, to make sure that we were having that representation. I did also contribute to making sure that we had in our UDHR section of the Human Rights Gallery, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, making sure if we talked about education, that we talked about the East LA walkouts, and then we talked about this history, and making sure that it was relevant, that people could see that we were a part of this as well. I'll move along. Because of our permanent human rights gallery, because of our bilingual space, we are now able to have Spanish speaking docents who can come in and speak to our students, and we can bring a whole new audience into this space that hasn't learned this history before and may not have the opportunity to learn this history in school. So just to highlight some of the things that we've done here at the museum since I started, our exhibits, as you can see in white, bring again those narratives that aren't commonly talked about, and programming such as conversations about intergenerational trauma through a Latinx lens. We've brought in films that highlight Central America and breaking those stereotypes, right? And one of the highlights here of this slide is the gentleman you see here, the liberator, Texas liberator, Johnny Marino, who was very connected to the museum, very much involved. And his work, not in his work, his representation here is very important. He is a part of our permanent Holocaust gallery. But not too long ago, the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission created an exhibition. I think I'm over my time, aren't I?
You
Created
can
an
finish yours.
I'll wrap it up very quickly. Created an exhibition about liberators. However, every liberator in that exhibition was a white man. So it took myself and our curatorial team to push and make sure that we had Latinx representation in that exhibit. It happened. We were able to include his narrative. And I'll fast forward very quickly. Anthony Acevedo is a part of the United States Holocaust Museum. Please, if you've not heard of him, please research him. He is a Holocaust survivor through the museum. He was a prisoner of war in Berga, and I definitely recommend you check it out. I told you again I would ramble, so if you have any questions, I can definitely provide you with more information about the work that we're doing.
Alrighty.
Okay.
All right, thank you. I'm going to thank you, Michelle. So, like I said, if you guys have questions, you guys can go ahead and post them, questions or comments, into the chat box. And we still have people coming in. All right. So give me a second. So I want to go ahead and give our next speaker, Sarah Zeneda Gould, who's going to be talking about diversifying representation in museum work. And she's going to focus on her career and creating spaces within her work to diversify representation, as well as the challenges to diversify, often within the museum. So Dr. Zeneda Gould is the interim executive director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. It is a national project um, to collect and disseminate Mexican American civil rights history. A longtime museum worker and public historian, she has curated over a dozen exhibits on history, art, and culture, and was formerly the founding director of the Museo del West Side, the lead curatorial research at the Institute of Texan Culture. She is the co-founder and co-chair of Latinos and Heritage Conversation, serves on the boards of the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission and on the Council of the American Association of State and Local History. She received a BA in American Studies from Smith College and an MA and PhD in American Culture from the University of Michigan. She is a former fellow at the National Museum of American History, the Winterthur Museum, and the American Antiquarian Society. So let's go ahead and welcome Dr. Gould.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. This is such a great panel that you've assembled here tonight. I was just gonna talk to you about some challenges and how to create spaces similar to what Michelle was talking about, creating spaces within institutions. And I will just start out by saying that I was very fortunate that one of my first job after grad school was at the Institute of Texan Cultures, which is a museum that opened in 1968 and was very much at the cutting edge of talking about multiculturalism before that was really even a widely known term. This is the layout of the Institute in 1968 when it opened. And I know that these letters are kind of small, but what you can see is that Institute of Texan Cultures meant that it was a museum space dedicated to talking about the different ethnic and racial groups of Texas. And so there's Spanish, there's Mexican, there's French, there's Anglo-American, Indian, some of these words we don't use anymore, Japanese, Dutch, Danish, Greek, French, on and on. And so really quite innovative at the time that it opened in terms of wanting to focus on all of these different groups that made Texas, Texas, right? That it's not just cowboys, although there's cowboys and there's vaqueros and there's African-American cowboys and all of that. But really kind of groundbreaking. Over the years, the exhibit floor evolved. This is 1980. At this point, I'll just point out that we still have Spanish and we still have Mexican here. And the next one, you're going to see a change. What you do see too is there was an addition that hadn't been there before of Jewish. Eventually, Spanish and Mexican got reworked as Tejano. And this is what the floor looked like in the 1990s. In the 1990s, I visited this museum as a teenager, and it kind of stuck with me. I think that in my family, I was very fortunate that we went to museums a lot. And I will just say, I grew up in Houston at a time when, thanks to oil money, most of the museums were free. And of course, they were all air conditioned. So we went to museums a lot. But going to this museum in San Antonio was really kind of eye-opening because I'd never really seen any place that was talking about Tejanos, right? And also learning about all these other ethnic groups. So it stuck with me. And then eventually I ended up working there. This is a photo actually of the Tejano exhibit as it looked in the early 90s, mid 90s. By the time I got there, in fact, like maybe a year before I got there, they had taken out the Tejano exhibit. And you might think, how in the world in San Antonio can you take out the Tejano exhibit? But they took it out because they wanted to create a space for a rotating gallery. And so for those of you in the museum world, you probably know, you sometimes need that rotating gallery space in order to get repeat visitors. Because if you don't have, it's like new shows, then people are like, oh, I've already seen that, right? So one of the things that I got to do when I had already been there a couple of years by the time the money appeared, and that's another recurring issue here is money. But by the time the money appeared to redo the Tejano exhibit, I'd already been there for a few years, but I'd been very, just itching to do this project. So we came up with a scheme or schematic for what we would do. One of the challenges that we had was that between the time, this layout was created and between the time this layout was created, Texas had become far more diverse. So even though we have these sections for all these different people, we still weren't including everybody. And in fact, we had lost a couple of people. You see in this 1980s one, there's a Filipino section. Well, the Filipino section, and actually it was still there in the 90s, but at some point it went away. And we also didn't have, for example, representation of South Asians, India, Pakistan, places that are huge in Texas in terms of population of South Asians in Texas. It's huge. We didn't have any representation of any of the various African countries that have settled in Texas. So a lot of this has to do with change in immigration law from 1965, and our floor just wasn't reflecting that. But at the same time, our floor stayed the very same size in 2014 when we were working on this as it was in 1968. So we really needed to be thinking about, if we're going to give every single ethnic group its own exhibit, those exhibits are going to have to shrink in size. And that doesn't seem very nice. And so we started to think about how can we put in a new model that would maybe be thematic and allow us to include more people under sort of big picture themes. So we started a baby step towards that with this Tejano exhibit, where we were sort of hashing out themes that we would then, sort of test drive this concept of themes and then try to eventually make the whole exhibit floor like that. This is the exhibit that resulted, and I'm not going to go too much into it because of the amount of time we have today, but we were quite successful in reimagining this exhibit, defining it along these thematic lines and demonstrating the popularity of an exhibit on Tejanos in San Antonio, a city that is majority Mexican American. So this exhibit was very well received. After that, it seemed like we needed a long overdue overhaul of our African American exhibit. Our African American exhibit, unfortunately, had been chipped away at over the years in terms of its real estate. And so this was an opportunity not only to redo the exhibit and bring it up to date, but also to reclaim a little bit of space that had been taken away from it. Things got a little complicated with this though, and I mentioned money before. Um, the appropriate thing to do, I think, and I think this was widely understood, was to find someone with expertise who was African American to curate this exhibit. And so the museum did attempt to hire on contract a guest curator to do this exhibit. And unfortunately, I'm not entirely clear if we weren't offering enough money or if the people who were approached simply didn't have the time, but we were not able to secure an African American curator for this exhibit. And so then I was told, this is now your project. And, it's not to say that I couldn't do it, but I really didn't think that it was the right thing to do. And again, I was told, it's your project now. So what I did do is I was able to get a little bit of money so that I could do a statewide tour and had some open house type events at African American museums around the state and invited the public to come to those events. And, we had refreshments and stuff. But the idea was to get input about how would you like to see this exhibit redone? And in the process of doing that, identified some people who could serve on a community advisory committee for the exhibit. So that was my workaround, for saying, because I didn't feel like it was the right thing for me to be doing this. The other thing is that we were able to identify somebody who was going to be a guest curator of just one section. And I was hoping that things might in fact continue in that direction, where maybe I could just break off little projects and find some outside expertise that we could bring on contract. So this Freedom Colonies section was going to be done by an outside historian. Unfortunately, we got to about this stage in the project where we had mapped out our themes, and the themes matched the same themes as in the Tejano exhibit, with the idea being that eventually we would have these themes across the whole floor and be able to bring in more groups, more ethnic groups. And we got to this stage, and then the funding got really tricky and the whole project was canceled. So the exhibit never got redone. I cannot even tell you how disappointing that was to me, but also how horrified I was to have to go and tell the people who I had, convinced to serve on this community advisory board, I'm sorry, this is postponed indefinitely. But these are challenges that we face at institutions where we have to figure out how to negotiate budgets, but also changing priorities above our heads. And so we always are trying to figure out, how can I insert, how can I keep pushing for something that's a little more thoughtful and a little more inclusive. I think that these days you can't get away with saying things like this, but if you recall back in the day, Cheech Marin would always say about his comedy and the politics in his comedy, he would say that he would slip it in their coffee. And again, I don't think we can say things like that these days, but just that idea that there are ways that you can work within your institutional system to create change without losing your job. And then sometimes you just decide, maybe it's time for me to leave this job. And so I was very fortunate a few years ago to be tapped to be the founding director of the Museo del West Side, which is something that the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center had been talking about for years, but funding, always an issue. They just had never gotten around to it. And then finally, it seemed like they had a moment where they were ready. And so they hired me, and we started planning in earnest for a community museum on San Antonio's West Side, the West Side being one of the most historic Mexican-American communities in the US and certainly here in San Antonio. We put together a whole team. We had a building that needed to be rehabbed, but still we had a building. And we started brainstorming exactly, you know, what are we going to do? How are we going to be a part of the community? How are we going to engage the community? How are we going to be really collaborative? And so we put together a community advisory committee, which develops the mission and vision statements. And this is on the website if you want to check it out. And some preliminary ideas for what we were going to do. We wanted to be free. We wanted to be incredibly relevant to the community. We wanted to take community ideas for exhibits and turn those into exhibits and take community stories and put those in the exhibits. We wanted to really collaborate with the schools that were in walking distance from the Museo and offer opportunities for students like a junior docent program. The high school that is in walking distance from the Museo has a construction and architecture program. And so we wanted to have those students involved in creating exhibits. We were already in a position to offer some walking tours, and we developed, within a few months of starting, developed a traveling exhibit called Los Courts, an exhibit about the Alazan Apache Courts, which is the oldest and largest public housing in San Antonio, and it's in just 2 blocks from the Museo del West Side. Architectural walking tours of the neighborhood to talk about the history and structures of the neighborhood. We also did a lot of community education around what is a museum and what sets a museum apart from something else, like an art gallery or just a building. And so we wanted to do that in order to get the community really invested in the idea that it's going to take some time for us to raise the money to really make this a reality, but B, when you're talking to your friends in the community or family members about why you're excited about the Museo, we want you to be able to talk about what is going to make this space so special and why we need to take extra care in everything we do with the Museo. So we talked a lot about these sorts of perhaps boring technical things, but they are pretty important in the museum world. We were able to get an architect who had worked on some other projects for the Esperanza on board, and he drew these beautiful renderings of the plans to rehab an existing historic building. So the existing historic building is this yellow and the cinder block building here. And then these buildings also are in the same complex. And so they would all kind of speak to each other, but this would be the house, the building for the Museo. This is a community center. And then back here is the Mujer Artes, which is a women's clay cooperative. And then there's just a bird's eye view, and you can see we were planning an addition onto the back of the historic building. The addition would be compressed earth block or adobe, which is the same as Mujer Artes is also compressed earth block. So very green. And then that's a photo of the complex there. And this is the Museo. And we actually, you can't see it, I'm sure it's so tiny, but we have put a banner up that said Museo del West Side coming soon. So that was a very exciting project. In the middle of the pandemic, very unexpected to me, and this was a very difficult decision to make, but I got a new job offer. And given the complexities of financing in the pandemic, I ended up taking the job offer. So I'm now with the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute, which is a very new organization. We were basically born mostly in the pandemic. So we've been operating completely remotely and digitally, but we are planning for a digital archive, and we have some digital exhibits that will be premiering this summer. Eventually, there will be a physical location for you to come and visit with exhibits and with archival collections that you can use for research purposes. This will be dedicated to telling the history of Mexican American civil rights. We want the nation to know that what Atlanta is to the African American civil rights movement, San Antonio is to the Mexican American civil rights movement. And so we want to highlight not just the Mexican American civil rights history of San Antonio and South Texas, but the whole nation. But we are rooted here in San Antonio. And so like our inaugural exhibit that will be opening this summer will focus on San Antonio and South Texas. And then from there, we'll be expanding rapidly. So I don't want to use up too much more time. You've got great people to hear from, but thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really good. And so, yeah, we go ahead and move on to Lisa Ramos. So Dr. Ramos is going to be discussing her role in fighting to remove the Texas Ranger mascot at San Antonio College and representing the teaching of race and racism within public institutions. So Dr. Ramos hails from the Lower Rio Grande Valley, my home area, from Brownsville, where she lives, where her family has lived for centuries. She received her PhD from Columbia University in 2008 and has taught at Texas A&M College Station from 2008 to 2015. She now serves as the Mexican American Studies Program Coordinator and the History Co-Coordinator at San Antonio College. She has taught courses on Texas history, U.S. history, Mexican American history, the history of race and racism of Texas, and Latino communities in the U.S. Her research focuses on Mexican American civil rights struggles, Black-Brown civil rights struggles, race, ethnicity, and the field of ethnic studies. So let me go ahead and welcome, hold on, I lost Lisa. So Dr. Ramos. Yes. All right, Lisa, you're up.
I'm up? Okay, I was just waiting for you to.
Yes, go ahead, Lisa.
You lost me, so I just wanted to make sure you found me. Okay.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you for having me, for inviting me. I work at a community college, but we've also struggled to dismantle white supremacy and address anti-racism. So that's what I would like to talk about today. And I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have some websites that I want to share that talk about what the students did. So I'm going to set my timer because also a rambler over here. So the first thing I want to do is, in talking about the San Antonio College Change the Ranger mascot campaign, is to acknowledge that I was not a major actor, I was a supporting actor. So the major actors in this campaign are the two women you see here, Nati Roman and Diana Flores, who I know that Dr. Carmona has had speak before at a panel that he organized, I think also with Jade Publishing or UTRGV.
Yes.
So
it was, yeah.
So I was a supporting actor, and what I did was, if not introduce, remind them of the stories that they had heard growing up. So Diana is also from the Valley, and she was my student in 2016. And in my classes, I teach Mexican American History Part 1 and 2. Those courses are set up as counter narrative histories, right? So there's the master narrative or the mainstream narrative. For example, Columbus is the discoverer of the Americas, is the master narrative. We use a different word in Mexican American history, right? He's not a discoverer, right? The term westward expansion, that's what you hear in most US history classes. That's not how it's taught in our classes in Mexican American histories. We don't use the word expansion. It's very neutral. We use the word invasion. There were already people there. So in our classes, we were learning these counter narrative perspectives. And what I saw happen with Diana and Nati is that they were realizing that they had to do something. We were learning that counter narrative histories are about finding those hidden histories and unhiding them, finding those erased histories and unerasing them, and finding out about historic injustices and a lack of public reckoning. And so when that happened, students like Diana and Nathi said, we can't just sit here and listen, we have to take action. And I'm sure anyone else who teaches ethnic studies knows that that happens to our students. They want to do something. So in November 2016, Diana said, Professor, I want to form a club. I want to form a Mexican American Studies student group. So she was the founding president of Somos Chicanx. Now they call themselves Somos La Gente. Nathi joined a few years later, and it changed them. They became leaders, they became advocates. When we learned about the Texas Rangers and what they had done in the Valley, La Matanza, the killings, the intimidation, the coercion, they realized, wait a minute, our mascot is a ranger. They did some research, and as they show here on the website, what they noticed is our institution, it is a Hispanic serving institution, is romanticizing the Texas Ranger. It's been doing that since 1926. How can a Hispanic serving institution have a ranger that for most of its existence, for I'd say 150 years of its existence, was terrorizing communities of color? So they led the campaign to get rid of the ranger, and they weren't only active in forming the student group, and I wanted to show you a few other pictures. They would go out into the community and they would go to different conferences. They wrote these petitions. And so my role all along was just to be there as a sounding board. Is this a good idea? The press has reached out. What do we do? So my role, I see my role as supporting them. I'm not supposed to be out in the front. I'm not supposed to be the sage on the stage. I'm the coach, the collaborator, the one that's got their back. And that's what I think is the sign of a true educator. You're not there to tell someone what to do. You're a collaborator, a coach, a supporter. And Nathi is also a wonderful poet, presented this poem at the conference on the 100th anniversary of the 1919 Canales investigation. So she's gonna have this published in an anthology coming out this summer. And so I was honored that some of the stuff they learned in my classes inspired them to become activists and advocates. And that's where I look to for inspiration, because now I have to talk about the more challenging part of my job as a faculty member in a community college. We all know that universities and colleges are neoliberal institutions, right? And just to bring that to life, I wanted you to see the structure of my institution. So my chair, so I'm here, Dr. Jonathan Lee was my chair. I would be under him, Mexican American Studies Program Coordinator. So if I want to make change within the institution, in the structure, I have to go to Dr. Lee, to the dean above him, then to the vice president, then to the president, and then that leads to the next level. My president answers to the chancellor, but also you've got some vice chancellors here who answers to the board. So it is very frustrating sometimes as a faculty member who wants to make a Hispanic serving institution more, more committed to anti-racism. What I dream of is something like this. This is the 10-point plan that San Diego State University recently issued. And they have a Latina president, by the way. And just a little side note, what I'm noticing in a lot of these institutions that are changing, that it's women of color leading them that are in the front lines. I think it's not an accident that all the speakers here are women and women of color. There's something about that energy and that commitment. I think that's important to maybe discuss during the Q&A. But these are the kinds of things I dream of, having each department review and redevelop coursework and curricula to advance racial and social justice. faculty learning communities, annual symposiums on Black lives and minds, and one on also Latinx lives and minds. I'd love stuff like this, but my institution, it's not ready to do that. Some of the problems that I faced when we tried to change the mascot, it took, this campaign to change the mascot started before the unfortunate senseless death of George Floyd. It started in, I want to say 2018, sometime middle 2018. But once all the protests last summer happened, the community college I work at, SAC, felt pressure. Okay, we've got to get rid of the mascot because the community's getting upset. The press is coming, doing interviews. We're looking bad, right? So this is a neoliberal world we live in, image, branding. You don't want to look good to your stakeholders. So what I learned, my frustrations were the colleges and universities, many of them are willing to issue statements condemning racism. Many of them are willing to issue proclamations saying that they're making anti-racism part of their mission. But I don't see the action like I'm seeing at San Diego State University. I'm part of the SAC mascot committee to identify a new mascot, and it's a top-down organization. Some of the ideas, some of the subcommittees have been nixed. So what I do to release the frustration is I've been working alongside two wonderful coordinators, Mexican American Studies program coordinators here in San Antonio, Dr. Sandra Garza at Northwest Vista College, Dr. Lori Beth Rodriguez at Palo Alto College, and Dr. Garza and Dr. Liliana Saldaña of UTSA came up with this idea, let's apply for a Mellon grant. And they went to the regs, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality studies department at UTSA, applied for this Just Futures grant to address anti-racism. And they got one of the 16 awards of 5 million. So I'm looking towards the outside because I'm not finding my college is ready yet to address anti-racism. And I'm joining efforts like this. And at some later date, I want to apply for another national grant and do something like Middlebury College did. They have something called the Twilight Project. And this project is intent on uncovering and reckoning with the histories of exclusion and marginalization at the college and its surrounding areas. So it's like a 3-year project. They're actually going to have students investigate what are the statues, the buildings, who are they named after? What is the backstory to the people they named after? Are they problematic? Should they have their names changed? And that's something I would like to do, apply for a grant so we can have a similar project at SAC. Lastly, I'll just add, because my time is up, is that I do want to form more community partnerships with the Esperanza. I love when Sarah was speaking and talking about going into the community with the Museo del West Side, asking what does the community want? And that is my dream too, is to build those bridges. Esperanza is literally right next door to my college. And I've had Graciela Sanchez speak once at our college, and we had another speaker, or someone else come, but we haven't done enough. I've also been working a little bit with the American Indians of Texas, the Spanish colonial missions. And so because I haven't gotten, I'm gonna stop sharing the websites, because I haven't gotten the support from the top, I'm looking laterally, I'm looking sideways, and that's where I'm finding the support. But that's a whole nother issue about university administration, but that's all I wanted to share. Thank you all.
Thank you, Lisa, for that. There's a lot of good work there, and and we're working on trying to do legislation to have a mascot bill here in Texas, which is going to be a hurdle. It's going to be a long process, but I think we can actually eventually do it. But yeah, I think that this work is extremely important. So I want to go ahead and move on to our next speaker, which is going to be Carolina Monsiváis. And Carolina is going to be speaking on her work in archiving ethnic Mexican women. She's going to discuss the troubles about finding information in the archives, and as well as the trouble, of women being recorded for historical events. Dr. Catalina Monsivais is the author of 3 collections of poetry, Somewhere Between Houston and El Paso, Alicia's Hunger and Descent. She holds a PhD in Borderlands history. And let's see here, my screen. In Borderlands history from the University of Texas, El Paso, and an MFA from New Mexico State University. She has worked many years with survivors of patriarchal violence, and she currently teaches at the history at the South Texas College, where she's the coordinator of the Mexican American Studies program. And lastly, she is the co-founder and co-organizer of Poets Against the Border, which has been a thriving project here in the Rio Grande Valley. So I'm going to go ahead and locate. Where are you? Let's see here. I've lost. Let's see. Garo, there you are.
There we go.
Yes. So, Carolina, go ahead.
Okay, well, good evening and thank you for having me. I did just want to make one small correction. It's Poets Against Walls. So just want to.
Oh, okay.
So
sorry.
and as Dr. Ramos was speaking, I was thinking about this connection between the community colleges, universities, and even community work. And although I'm not going to speak on it, I would love to continue corresponding with a lot of the panelists to talk about the issues in particular. But I'm going to kind of shift a little bit here and talk about my archival work. And, I always stress that I'm also a writer and a poet because I tend to kind of like get a little flowery. So that I couldn't write about this and speak on this without, in my own way. So for me to even begin, it's impossible for me to even begin talking about this without this image of a wrought iron fence. And I always call it the wrought iron fence in my writing. And it only opened manually to this property where my great grandmother lived, along with her daughter, granddaughter, and her sister and another tia. And this property was nestled between 2 buildings containing businesses like a panaderia along a very busy and bustling street in Tijuana, all women. And I was always drawn to them and drawn to this question of how in a patriarchal world did these women create this like perfect insulated world for themselves? And how did my great grandmother acquire this land in a city notorious for and built on vice? And I do focus a lot on vice. A woman counted in a city census with a baby in her arms, made a life for herself in this home, and she could have disappeared from history forever. But I'm telling you that she existed. And she managed to acquire this land during a time that was really notorious, marked by US prohibition, which is another thing that I really focus on in my research. And while vice industries tended to dominate, adjacent businesses also sprung up, like shops, souvenir shops, and other kinds of necessities that tourists might need. And this is how they maintained themselves. And it was these women in these domestic, private spaces that inspired me to write and research, to know that even in these spaces that are not deemed worthy of recognition, women made history. And while I was never really discouraged from looking for women, there was always this sense when I went to archives that I might not find anything, but go ahead and look. And I mainly focused my research in Texas. And I went, and I began my search in this era on this particular topic, looking for women. And this era has been historically eclipsed by shootouts and gangsters, all the really flashy, notorious things about this era. And finally, with patience, I did find them, hundreds of them in the criminal records, all tightly packed within boxes inside envelopes that had never been opened before. Some of them that had disintegrated in my hands and were marked by rusted paper clips. Because the state had held such an anxiety over, especially women in particular, who were selling alcohol or drugs and sometimes their bodies, there had generated hundreds and hundreds of documents. And at this point, the challenge for me became whether or not to accept the state narrative that cast them as criminals, which of course I didn't. Instead, I read against the grain in order to understand their choice to participate in these vice-related industries, mainly within their homes, to support their families. And I felt that needed to be included in the larger historical narrative. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the research I did and then just close it off there. So during this era, borderlanders would cross into Mexico, both to partake in vices that they could consume there and smuggle back into the US. And the vice that made its way into this region included alcohol, narcotics, and sex workers. And the focus of my research has been on the way that the vice manifested itself north of the border and what that has meant, the way it was policed, especially during this era, and the interactions that resulted between law enforcement and women who were suspected of participating in vice-related industries. The regulation of vice along the border opened avenues of scrutiny over their bodies and behavior, and as prohibition-related laws granted law enforcement agencies the ability to deepen their surveillance from the official border into the communities north of it. And through these law enforcement interactions that extend from earlier Texas Ranger activities aimed at controlling certain populations, I'm able to view their lives during this era in order to argue that they actively participated in vice-related industries during an era in history where they have been largely ignored. And these interactions became a lens for me through which women expressed agency, knowledge, and even forms of resistance. And the women in these cases demonstrated resistance by defending their homes and participating. And it helped them make a living, but also to a certain extent to undermine the system. So in many ways, these interactions would push them from these private places into public places where they would often have to go to court and defend themselves. And it also becomes clear that their participation in these industries along the US-Mexico border impacted laws and trends that developed throughout this era. So in other words, their participation also changed laws, forced a lot of law enforcement to change tactics and laws in order to adjust to having to work and deal with women. And that was my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. That was very good. I just want to mention that she actually found my great grandmother's information in her research. So yeah, so I learned actually a lot about my great grandmother from your research there.
Right.
Yes.
They were very explicitly, much more detailed than I expected. Right?
Yeah.
Very closely at the way the women were behaving.
But yeah, so yeah, I just want to mention that. I'm going to go ahead and introduce our last speaker for the night before we open up to questions. Just want to remind you guys that that you can go ahead and make sure you put your questions and comments into the chat, and we will address them when we get to the question and answer session. So give me a second here. All right. So for our last speaker, we have Mireya Loza, who is going to be speaking about her work in documenting American history through a Latinx lens. And so, excuse me. Hold on. Dr. Loza is an associate professor in the Department of History and American Studies program at Georgetown University. She earned her doctorate in American Studies and an MA in Public Humanities at Brown University. Hold on. Her areas of research include Latinx history, public history, labor history, and food studies. Her book, Defiant Braceros: How Migrant Workers Fought for Racial, Sexual, and Political Freedom, which is a really good book, and I'm just going to plug that, examines the Bracero program and how guest workers negotiated the intricacies of indigeneity, intimacy, and transnational organizing. Her first book won the 2017 Theodore Salutis Book Prize awarded by the Immigration and Ethnic History Society and the Smithsonian Secretary Research Prize. In addition to her academic research, she was a curator at the National Museum of American History and continues to work on several projects with that museum. So let's go ahead and welcome Dr. Losa.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Okay, so let me start also by sharing my screen, and I'll tell you a little bit about my work, and I will try to be as brief as I can be. So my entry to public history was actually as a graduate student in the Bracero History Project. Dr. Tovar told us a little bit about how she hosted this exhibition. And to be sure, this was a multi-year project. And as a graduate student, I was asked to help basically develop a structure by which we'd collect these oral histories across the US and Mexico. And I stayed on the project throughout graduate school, and I decided that I really enjoyed doing public history, going to communities, having town hall meetings, getting to know people, and talking to them about the importance of this work. So for me, all of this was critical to how I understood my practice and how I understood engagement. Steve Velasquez at the National Museum of American History took the lead to actually create an exhibition around Bracero history. This exhibition toured for about a little under a decade, so it was quite a popular exhibition. People really enjoyed it. And I think part of the reason why people enjoyed it, it was an opportunity to see themselves as actors in American history. Oftentimes in the museum world, Latinos are relegated to the arts, to performance, but not usually to being historical actors in the story of America. And so this was one moment where people got to see themselves as just that, and got to see their communities as just that. I went on to write a book about braceros, but I also continued to be interested in public history. And in 2016, I returned to the National Museum of American History as a curator. And my job was basically to expand several collections: the Civil Rights Collection, the Agriculture Collection, the Labor Collection. These all seem like disparate collections, but the reality is that for the Latinx history story, these collections are intertwined. For these communities, labor rights have always been intimately tied to civil rights. And for these communities, basically, work is also a site to push back. And so I had a lot of fun doing this at the National Museum. And I also got basically to work on some of the most gigantic projects that were at that point on the museum's table. One was to create an exhibition basically to commemorate women's suffrage. And for this exhibition, we gathered experts in women's history. We gathered many, and invited many experts that we thought would not only teach us about the new trends in American history, but also push us to think outside of the box. And one historian of African-American girlhood and African-American history, Marcia Chatelain, said, "Why are you creating an exhibition to celebrate the centennial of suffrage? Many museums across the nation will do that. If you'd really like a fresh look at women's history, you should think about girlhood." And so that is exactly what we did. We started thinking about girlhood. And for me, as a Latinx historian, I kept thinking, how are we going to incorporate Latinas in every aspect of this exhibition? And so this is going to sound kind of sad. So in October, we opened up this exhibition, in which we'll be traveling across the US for many years. But sadly, we also opened it up in a pandemic on the brink of a new closure of the exhibition. So the exhibition was open and the museum hosted it for a blink of an eye and had to close back down because of the pandemic. But the pandemic also pushed all of us working on the exhibition, because exhibitions of this size happen in teams, and I'm just one of 4 curators on this exhibition, pushed us all to think more rapidly about how we could get this material on the web. And so I'll show you some of this. So this exhibition opens up with a section on news and politics. And one of the things we purposely wanted to do throughout the exhibition is to integrate young women of color throughout the exhibition. When I was asked to do this, I remember telling the curatorial team, I cannot have this look like an American Girl, Doll Girl story. This has to have bite. And they said, yes, of course it's going to have bite. These young women are not going to be flat. These young women are not going to be screaming, this is about girl power. We're going to show girls that have complicated histories, girls that actually build politics and have a political voice, girls that work, girls that maybe engage in fashion as a political act to show other aspects of their identity. And so we started this project with this really complicated view of what it meant to be a girl in America. As we worked on this exhibition, I was asked to narrate chunks of it. And so on the splash page, I will put this in the chat. If you go on to the exhibition website, you'll actually start hearing my voice and some of my story, because we were using it as a narrative device. Let me go to the chat so I can share these. Okay. So you can actually land on the page. I headed up a section on work. And the idea here is that young women have always been part of the workforce, and that young women built America. That young women were not playing often with little dolls and reading books, that most girls in America throughout a longer part of American history have had to be contributors in their communities, either through formal work or informal work. For me, one of the guiding lines to think about this was to also think about how Latinas have done this. And because I am a labor historian, primarily on agriculture, I thought the story of agriculture would help us flesh that out. I not only had to look at the existing collections, but I also had to build new collections, because if you all know, you don't always, you go to a museum to see things in boxes too. They can't just be, there can't be nothing there. So especially at the National Museum of American History, it's object driven. And so I had to do new collecting around this. And one of the things that I did is I actually went to farm worker sites to actually talk to people who had been farm workers as young women. And I collected several objects, but one of my favorites is this object. This object on this platform is also rendered 3D. So you can actually move it around, look at it. You can look at the back of it. And this was also, because of the pandemic, this accelerated this process of trying to get as much of the collection digitized so that people can actually see it online. We also worked girls through every section. So I'll show you some of the pictures of the exhibition so that you can get a sense of what it looks like. Sorry, I'm experiencing a bit of a delay, but it'll pop up. So this is what you'd walk in and see. It has various sections. My favorite, because I worked on it the most, was work, but you come into a section called news and politics, education, work, wellness, fashion, girls' life. I'll show you just some of my favorite highlights. We worked with an artist to actually begin to render some of these historical images as murals. So we wanted mural size images of these young women. We wanted people to actually encounter them. And I pulled a lot from archives, accounts of young women to actually populate the section with their voices. So you'll see here, Maria Elena Durazo's quote about really her work as a farm worker. We also, this is going to look like a funny picture, but it's two. I also wanted to work really hard to incorporate the history of African-American girls throughout the section, and not to render them the kind of worker that we were used to seeing, which is basically we want to see them in our imagination in fields because those are the stories we've heard. But I wanted people to actually see these little girls as little girls, but also in the mode of work. And so through portraiture, I was able to juxtapose this idea that these are not little girls that are actually in leisure, but that these are little girls actually laboring, because often these little girls were nannies and basically caretakers of white babies. And so I found that this juxtaposition really brought them to life in a really different way than we know the story. And then I told stories that were basically the classic story of young girls working in mills. And finally, my favorite, young girls as farm workers. I worked to collect in the contemporary, but also mined archives so that I could show them in the past, so that we can juxtapose this continuum between what they did in 1920, 40, and in the present. So these are some of the highlights, but there are also Latina stories in the section of fashion. There's also Latina stories in the section of wellness. We wanted to make sure that they were throughout the exhibition, that Latinas weren't a sidebar, but integral to telling the story of girls in America. So this is from the section on education. We really wanted to highlight the DACA story. And so I collected a pair of wings because I thought that that was probably one of the most emblematic and moving images that I could find, objects that I could find that really showcases the story of DACA girls pushing back and saying, we are citizens, cultural citizens, and we deserve to be seen as residents, and we deserve to belong in this American story. So this is kind of what I do really and work really hard to do, is really to always kind of show the story on a big stage, but also to make sure that it's present and integral to the American story. I'll show you a couple of other things I've done recently around basically showing girls as active participants in civil rights movements, as active participants in social change. And this is one such way I do it. I actually do it both through blogs, through digital collections, but also, so I pull actually from our existing digital collections to tell the story of Jessica Govea, who was basically a girl who grew up in the CSO, the Community Service Organization, and later became a leader in the United Farm Workers. And then I also do it through videos. So this is probably one of the newest things right now during the pandemic that I've had to start practicing doing, because videos are a great way to basically make sure that people outside of the geography of DC can enjoy the collections, enjoy the stories, but also learn about the history of Latinas in the US. Let me show this, send this to everyone so that you can enjoy it on your own. And because I'm interested in these topics, I also just try to spotlight a lot of stories that I think are critical, basically stories of Latinas doing civil rights work, doing activism, or engaging in activism. And one of my favorites is basically working on creating a case, a real life case, to tell the story of Luisa Moreno, but also making sure that we also leave a digital footprint so that when the case goes down and it's no longer at the National Museum of American History, that the story lives on. So I had the great honor of getting some gifts from the great historian, Vicky Reese, who's working on a biography of Luisa Moreno, to drive this case and to actually show Luisa Moreno's objects. Show you this one too. And then the last thing I want to share before we go to Q&A is I want to send out basically an announcement for internships, paid internships at the NMAH, so that if anyone here is interested in basically gaining experience at the National Museum of American History, they can apply. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for all the participants. You guys did great presentations here today. And I want to go ahead and you know, turn it over to the audience to ask any of these you know, these fantastic scholars questions that you might have. So if we want to go ahead, is anybody, before I read the ones in the chat box, if anybody wants to say something, you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Yes. If not, I will pick on Sarah. So, Sarah Rafael Garcia. Sarah, are you with us?
Oh, sorry. There's two of us on there.
Yes, I know. That's why I had to say your full name.
I am so inspired at this amazing panel. What really caught my eye and come along to listen is I was in Houston doing a fellowship in 2019 and got to visit the Holocaust Museum. And I was just in awe on the intersectionality of it. And I was wondering who were the great minds behind it and how did it happen and why isn't this available everywhere? So I really appreciated seeing the work there and then hearing the talk today, because I did wonder how it all happened. I knew it didn't happen overnight, and I knew there was a lot of people fighting the good fight behind closed doors. But it also was extremely exciting to hear the rest of the panelists and knowing the work that's happening across the nation. And you know, I always tell people I'm from two valleys. I was born in Brownsville, Texas. I grew up in Santana, so it's nice to see familia on the screen representing. And you know, highly inspired by all of you all and all the work you're doing, especially offering counter narratives to women and to young girls. So it's just a lot of praise. I don't have a question.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I just want to go ahead and mention that, you know, the fact that this panel was all women was actually also, a friend of mine who I think is here as well, is the one who pointed out that, you know, this is a perfect example to show during Women's History Month, right? That these different women who are doing this work and the work that you guys do. But I will go ahead. I think that Mona Chavez, you have a question? Is she with us? Or did we lose her? Her question was for you, Michelle, and it was, what can you say about the Jewish populations that were exiled from Spain to the Americas?
Yeah, some of the folks that did send me questions on here, I did tell them, let's talk privately. It would take, you know, probably another hour to talk about these things. But no, I'm very grateful that Sarah for your comment, because yeah, I mean, Maria has been in the field forever and I highly admire her work. But it's been tough, you know, and maybe, I don't know if she shares the same experience, but being in this field as a Latina, especially in a space like a Holocaust museum, has been very challenging. You know, it's been difficult, you know, trying to convince people why it's not right to have smaller Spanish print than our English print on our walls, right? Like minor things like that, right? And even to the fact of like bringing these narratives to the board and getting that acceptance. And our Jewish community also asking, how is this relevant to our museum space? So it's been challenging. It's been a lot of work, and I'm glad that I'm a part of this, and I'm glad that I can open the door for other Latinx and students who are interested in this work.
Thank you, Michelle. Brian, did you have a question?
I just wanted to say thank you to all the panel. As a future museum or archival professional, I'm looking forward to engaging with the community. I graduated with a master's degree in public history from U of H in spring of 2020. And I'm just now pursuing a master's of library science with the University of North Texas at Denton through online. So I'm looking forward to learning more about public history, archives, and other opportunities. So this is a great opportunity for me to learn more about the work that scholars are doing in the public history world.
Thank you, Brian. All right, Myra, I think you had a question. Go ahead, Myra.
Hi, Dr. Tovar. Can you hear me? how did you and your team decide to include fronteriza representation from the Behind the Barbed Wire exhibit and oral presentation by Dr. Yolanda Leyva at the University of Texas at El Paso? And what did it mean for your community, the Jewish community? And what does it mean for the Houston Holocaust Museum?
Thank you for asking that question. So we, I've created partnerships throughout Houston with universities and other organizations to, collaborate on ideas. And one of the this came about our collaboration with the University of Houston downtown with a group called Latinas Achieve, right, led by two amazing women who were interested in bringing Dr. Leyva's work here and were knew about the border work she'd been doing, make her collections there. And so, of course, we provided the space again, right? If we didn't have this space or my role here, I don't know if that would have been a talk that would have been held here, right? So yes, it was by our community, by our Latinx community was, very happy to, be a part of it. This was an in-person event. We had students from college, high school level here to the general public. And so our Jewish community has been interested, right? Our general audience has been interested in wanting to learn more. So because of that, and the work I've been doing here with our Latin American initiatives as well, with our narratives, bringing those in, this coming in April, we're going to host our first Latinx Arts juried show that's going to bring in topics like the issues that Dr. Leyva talks about, the borderlands, right? We're going to be able to have people express themselves through art and talk about immigration, women's rights. So we're very excited to have that opportunity in this space for people to be able to share that, right? What's unfortunate is, again, like I mentioned before, the challenge is making sure people understand why it's here, why it's present here, why we're including it in our human rights. So it's a challenge.
Thank you. All right, we do have a question for Dr. Ramos, and that's coming from Juan. Juan, you want to ask your question? Do we have Juan Garcia? So I think the question here was asking about the future of anti-racist action is not compatible with our university systems. This is asking if we could hear some thoughts on this from the panelists, I guess from all of you guys, thinking about the structure of the university and how your work kind of fits into how we think about anti-racist action. So that's thrown out to all of you guys. If somebody wants to speak about that.
Well, I think it's not just the university system that anti-racism isn't compatible with, right? I think most of these big organizations, whether it's, museums or universities or certain large corporations, they're neoliberal in structure, profits before people, managerial, surveillance, lots of accountability, individualism. It's not about collaboration, cooperation, it's about competitiveness. So the way I try to change that, I'm not the college president, I'm not the college vice president, I'm not a dean, I'm not a chair, but the classroom, that is where, at least up until now, I have the power. And that's why I will bring in those speakers from the American Indians of Texas at the Spanish colonial missions. They can't see what I'm teaching every day, and I'll teach them. This is something I struggle with. Many of us who are professors, we talk too much. I was just watching my Zoom recording from Wednesday, and I'm like, why did I keep talking? I should have let the students who are talking speak. So trying to learn myself constantly. I've been teaching for 20 years now, but to learn how to listen, to reflect so that the students can take the initiative, take over the classroom, and that I become more the facilitator. So I do think by being a model of a good leader, and a good leader is not always the star of the show. A good leader is in the background helping other people learn how to be the star. So I think, yes, in general, my community college, the universities, they're not going to ever, I think most of them say, yes, we're about anti-racism, let's revamp the whole curriculum, let's put up monuments to people of color where they should have been, but in the little space I have that I can control, that's where I think I can make a difference. And a lot of us who are scholars in ethnic studies, we have those collaborations, or we're participants in like Somos Más in San Antonio, but I don't want to dominate this. So I'll just say those are the thoughts I have so far.
Well, I'll just kind of add on that because I consider myself a longtime activist, and I've only really been at the college for maybe a couple of years and just became the coordinator for Mexican American Studies last semester. So I have plans. I have a lot of plans. And so I'm going to kind of tiptoe and figure out what kinds of actions and programs I can put on gradually. But so that's why one of the reasons I stress that I'm also part of an organization called Poets Against Walls, because I also recognize that sometimes within your own institutions that there's limitations, right? I do consider myself maybe a little bit more like the work we do is a little more radical. So, we kind of put on these presentations, and since the pandemic, we've moved a lot of our actions online, so you can look for us and follow a lot of what we do. So we bring in a lot of presentations, poets, writers, activists, to talk about these things in order to build up this movement against anti-racism and sexism and homophobia. And so it really is just a matter of trying to balance these two things. And often when I do my community work, I don't identify myself, right, as a college professor often, right? Like they'll figure it out. They find me, right? Like they always do searches, and a lot of I think the vice president of the college already pointed out that they are aware of the actions that I'm taking in the community. So either they hired me anyway, right? They know what they're getting. So I just try to find a way to kind of balance those things. And I think as I keep, building up the program, one of the things is going to be to encourage students to do more community work, right? To do collaborations with a lot of the community organizations that are working on these particular issues, and to get students more involved. And really just like, you said, like being the facilitator, sometimes you have to like say, well, maybe you could do this, but not always tell people exactly what to do, but maybe kind of draw them to the actions themselves. And I really feel like, just based on a lot of the conversations I'm having with students in class, that this is the time. They are ready. They're ready to have these conversations, and they're ready to get involved.
Thank you. There's 3 of you guys left. So should I call on you like I do my students? So Sarah, you want to say something about your work or the anti-racist work?
Sure. I'm an eternal optimist. I got to tell you, I think this is possible. Yeah, things don't happen overnight, but I think this is absolutely possible. And I say that because we are doing the work. There's no denying that, right? And I think back to the late 60s, early 70s, and the actions that took place on universities and college campuses across the country, which gave us spaces for ethnic studies. We had to demand that space, right? And we have to, it hasn't always been easy to keep that space, right? It's something that we have to say continually, this is necessary, we need more resources. And I was very saddened to learn, actually just earlier today, about Rose Wong's death. If you don't know about Rose Wong, she, as a high school senior, applied to Smith College, my alma mater, twice, and both times had her application denied because on some of her paperwork, male was checked off. She led a movement that successfully saw over a dozen women's colleges change their admissions policies for trans women. And so I want to remember Rose Wong and acknowledge all that she did to bring about change. And I'm so saddened by her death. Change is possible, and we do it from the inside, we do it from the outside, we do it from all sides. We don't always get exactly what we want, but we keep working towards it.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. right, Mireya, you want to say something?
I mean, and well, the work that many of us, well, not many, all of us do, is always rooted in anti-racist politics. And I think at the National Museum of American History, it's even more important because I think that DC right now has become this kind of battleground where people want to claim history in space and say, this is what American history is. That is what American history is. And when American history doesn't include people of color, then for me, it is not a complete story of America. And so I think most of my colleagues would agree that we do this in increments, we do this day by day. And for me, I'm very inspired by the activism of young people right now, but one of the things I'm most excited about is to show them the lessons of people who were in similar positions, asking similar questions about equity, access, about civil rights, about the past, and to show them this is what they did. They left you a blueprint. They literally gave you a blueprint for change. And so history is not, I always love to say, history is not teleological, which means it doesn't go to some progressive, perfect place. We go back and forth in terms of losing things, gaining things, losing things. And I think the last 4 or 5 years has been the lesson that we weren't going generation after generation to a better place than, say, for instance, someone, doing activist work in the 1960s. They were asking similar questions. They were fighting similar battles. Now, how is it that we look towards the past to find answers that people have already, tried to work out tools that they've left us? And how do we take those and implement them in the present? How do we finish this kind of question about how do we all become full citizens in the US? How do we all have full belonging here? And so in some ways, that's what I do. That's what I love to do. That is the stuff that, makes me excited. And it makes me excited to also show young people that it isn't just older people asking these questions. So much great civil rights work was done by 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds. Labor movements were started by 18-year-olds and 17-year-olds. And I love to highlight that because, when I teach Latinx history classes, I love to have pictures of folks like Emma Tenayuca or folks like Luisa Moreno and ask these big questions, to an 18-year-old. Were you doing what she was doing? Because she was, she was doing her thing every day. And she was doing something in terms of really organizing workers, thinking broadly about civil rights. And so, I love to say, capitalists aren't going to save us. Organizing will. Labor organizing will. Civil rights organizing will. So my work is to just show it in the past, to bring it to people in the present.
Thank you. Yes. So, Michelle, you want to say something here?
Just very quickly, a lot of our anti-racist work right now is taking a look internally. After George Floyd, of course, our museum put out a statement, and I've tried my best to hold the museum accountable for that statement and making sure that we are going to be held accountable for what we do, right? And so because of that statement, we created a racial justice committee within the museum to take a look at our institutional racism, because you cannot be in a Holocaust museum without understanding, right? And being held accountable for your statements. So that's the work that I've been doing aside from Latino initiatives, is making sure that we can, professionally develop our staff, inform our staff and make sure that they're connected to understanding the history of the Holocaust and genocide and current social issues, right? I think if you're a staff member in a space like this, you have to be conscious and aware of what's happening.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for your answers. Those are very important responses. I think that, there's a lot there that, the kind of work, that I also do is also in all different fields, right? in the classroom, in the literary world, right? Also doing the public history work, taking on popular culture things like Walker, Texas Ranger, which is a horrible show for different reasons. But but now I'm going to go ahead and Pamela Morales, you had you mentioned something about us, Margaret McCallan's scrapbook. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So at the Museum of South Texas History inside the Margaret H. McCallan Memorial Archives, there's actually a really interesting scrapbook by the matron of the 1922 jail, which obviously is no longer there in Edinburgh, Texas. But the interesting thing about the scrapbook is the matron, she actually had kept a lot of notes from former inmates, which were all women, and they basically were very touching because they thanked her for helping them while they were in the prison. I guess I just brought it up with the who was it, Carolina, that had talked about that. Was it? Now I lost track of who had that presentation about female inmates in prison and all that stuff. So it just made me think about that, how there's something to be said about that scrapbook with women in prison and the reason why they were in there.
Caro, you want to respond?
No, I was just going to say thank you, and I will be in touch. So I'll go take a look. Thank you for letting me know.
Yes, thank you. All right, Priscilla, you have a question for the panel?
Hi, yes. I can't remember which person it was that mentioned it. I think maybe it was the fourth person that spoke, but she mentioned something about doing ancestry research. And then Dr. Carmona, I think she had found something on your family. I'm just curious, what resources have y'all used for ancestry type research?
Well, that's actually a funny story, right? Because Chris had mentioned that I was working on this topic and he mentioned his grandmother or his great grandmother, and then you found something on Ancestry on one of the websites.
Yes.
And then so all I had was her name really to go on. And so when I went through through the archives, just hundreds of these women's names, I just stumbled across her file. And it was pretty extensive. So, and then there was multiple parts to her. So she was very busy during Prohibition. And so it just really just depended. It was really just luck, actually, that I came across her, and there was all this information on her, and we were able to piece together, like a little narrative on her. But it rarely happens. I thought, what are the odds that I'm going to actually find her in the archive? I did.
Yes.
So, yeah, because other people had given me names also, and their names hadn't popped up. So it was just really a matter of luck and patience, a lot of patience to be able to go through all these files until I finally came across her file.
Yeah. So just trying to clarify, my great grandmother was Emilia Cuellar, and she was a very successful bootlegger in the 1930s, and she ran a lot of this stuff out of the house, and it was a very strange case of the way she was caught. And she was actually kicked out of the country, and on her deportation paper it said a bad moral character. But she came back anyway, and she ended up living the rest of her life here. But that was because I had found that actual form. I think I'd found my grandmother's stuff, which is her crossing paper, where she was denied to come back. And on the back side where they stamp Y, it says bad moral character. That's what started this whole thing, when you stumbled across Y. But yeah, so it's really interesting. But thank you for the question, Priscilla. I'm gonna go ahead to, I think we have more questions here. Let's see. So, Juan, you want to ask a question? I think you came back on, or did we lose you again? I think they were asking to share the link. Not sure which link exactly. I think it's the one you posted, maybe that's there. about the the internship availability. Gabriela Sanchez, you have a question for the panel? Do we have her or did we lose her? Okay, so I'll go ahead and ask her questions. Could any of you guys talk about community-based archiving? Are there workshops about teaching folks outside the university and museums how to archive their histories and store their records? All right, so she asked me to read this question. So if any of you guys want to talk about outside a community-based archiving.
Well, I will mention one thing. At the Smithsonian, there is a Latino Museum Studies program. I'm an alum, Dr. Tovar is an alum, and they've recently started adding basically a practicum with an archivist. And so in the last couple of years, the archives has taken on a young fellow, and I would encourage you to look at the Latino Museum Studies program. They're also doing phenomenal work around training around conservation and other aspects. When I was a fellow, and I think too, when Dr. Tovar was a fellow, basically conservation and archives wasn't one of the focal points. And now they're actually doing that more. And they're really trying to bring in people who are interested in archival processing and other aspects of museum work.
Anybody else want to try to tackle the community-based archiving?
Well, I think there are really two things happening in that question. So there's community archives, and then there's personal archives, right? So those are two different things. So community archives are, for example, what the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center is doing, creating an archive that is from the community and that is accessible to the community, and that is not associated with some big institution like a university, and the museum that it will be affiliated with will be a community-based museum. So there's that. But then there's personal archiving or sort of like family history conservation. You can find resources about how to do that online. Some places that you might look include the Austin the State Library has some brochures I think you can download from Austin, and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on their official name, but it's the State Library that's based in Austin, and they have some brochures you can download. But honestly, I think that if you just start Googling like how to preserve photos, you can find so many different archives have pages like that on their websites to try to help people with their family collections. Just the most basic thing is, of course, keep things away from hot, either extremely hot or extremely cold or moist environments. If you can, get some acid-free boxes. A place you can buy it locally if you're in a big city is like a Container Store actually has acid-free boxes, acid-free tissue paper. And you basically, you just want to keep things like that in a dark, climate controlled environment as best you can, because light will damage things, moisture will damage things, high temperature can warp things. I know I grew up in Houston, and we always had this problem with pictures on the wall getting warped from the humidity. So you're trying to avoid things like that. If you have things like cassette tapes, I know I have a very valued cassette tape that is of my late grandmother giving an oral history when I was in 8th grade. I recorded an oral history with her on a cassette tape, and I got that digitized so that the cassette tape, I still have it, but I don't even have a cassette tape player. So there are places that will digitize things like that for you if you want to have sort of a copy that you can use to play or to distribute to other family members. You can do that with VHS tapes if you have like family videos or things like that. That would be the basics.
Yes, I think you covered a lot there. But yeah, just to let you know that something like keeping these items can be tricky. I once did a presentation on the Rangers in Dallas, and one of the people in the audience at the end of it gave me this 1911 map the last map that had the Spanish land grants of the valley, and it was an actual 1911 map. It had like the authentication card, and I was so paranoid about taking that on the plane because they're going to put it through a scanner, the whole deal. And then what I ended up doing was I ended up donating to our archives there at the university so they can preserve it, because I just don't trust it in my house, you know. But it's, you know, this is a rare map that actually was the last year that they printed the Spanish land grants, so the names of the people who actually had those. So right now it's in the archives at UTRGV in Brownsville, so it's been digitized and it's safe there. So I still use those, even though people give me things like that every once in a while. I store them there because I'm just afraid that things are going to get damaged. But yeah, that's an important thing. You know, work with the local archives, because there's a lot of people around who you know genuinely want to help. And you know, donating these things to these archives are really a lot there. But I just want to do one last thing before we go. I want to go ahead and recognize Melba. Yes, if you want to go ahead and say something to Melba's Lisa's former teacher.
Yes, but she said, I've been teaching 20 years. I'm like, how old is she? She was just in my high school class last year.
I just want to say it's awesome to have you here, Dr. Lucio. I love it because she was my 10th grade English teacher. So to have one of my inspirations here, and then to have one of my students here, Nati Roman, I love it. Just, yeah.
And Lisa was the state speller.
Oh, yeah.
YL for 4 years in a row. She was the best speller in the state of Texas.
It was
that's right.
It was 2 Mrs. Liz.
It was the whole time that I was your coach. Don't make fun. Lisa's that way. She doesn't like the glory. But we beat all those gringas. No offense, anyone. But it was neat because I remember that at one spelling bee, they said that the word was serape. And all my students just looked at me like, serape, do they mean sarape? I'm like, well, my students don't understand that pronunciation. And the guy says, no, the word is serape. But I asked, I know they paid attention, like, oh yeah, that's what she means. But I'm working right now. I'm a co-founder of Team Brownsville. If y'all have heard of Team Brownsville and how we're working with asylum seekers right now at the Matamoros encampment. And so I have a little school going on there right now with, we have 300 children actually incarcerated there in a terrible situation. They've been living in camps for 2 years, and we feed them and we clothe them and we give them hope. So we're hoping any minute that we can see them at the bus station here, but the courts are still closed. So they're stuck because of MPP, and we continue to validate and give them hope, and that's what we need. We just need to keep pushing and saying yes, sí se puede. And I have my students before the pandemic, they were in there teaching with me, you know, on the sidewalk because we didn't have a school, and they're living in tents, literally. And I just, you know, today I sent a bunch of coats and stuff because it's going to get in the 30s and living in a tent. I mean, it's just like sad story. There's a lot of work to do still. And thank you all for your inspiration.
Thank you. Thank you, Melba, for all that you do.
And thank you for coming to my class.
No problem.
Dr. Carmona, for inviting me. And I had so many papers to grade, and I'm like, what am I doing here? And then I saw Lisa, and I'm like, oh, that's why I'm here. So it was very interesting. Invite me again.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you guys for attending this talk. I think we had a very good talk. And I want to thank all of the panelists for all of the work that they do and their various institutions. And And yes, I want to thank you. This talk was recorded, and I will be putting it up on YouTube, so you can share it with different people and your students, hopefully. But yes, thank you everybody who attended, and thank you for the great panel. Thank you guys.
Well, thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it. That was great.
Well, thank you. You did a lot of great work there. Thanks. And your background is awesome.
Okay. Well, because my place is messy. I don't want anyone to see my messy place. But I'll be in touch. I know we still got
Yes.
work.
I think I'll try to meet next Friday so we can talk about the bill.
Okay.
Yes.
Sounds good.
All right.
Bye.
Talk to you later. Bye.